Welcome back to this Arena special where we're celebrating the 150th anniversary of the birth of William Butler Yeats. His marriage to George Hyde Lees in 1917, she was 25, he was 51 at the time. Very successful marriage, very resilient marriage. What effect did it have on his work, Harry? You had your hand up immediately to comment on this one.
Well, we were talking a little bit earlier about muse poetry and muses, and I don't want to make too simplistic, a set of oppositions here. If you look at Yeats's work, it wouldn't appear that his wife is very visible in the work, whereas right to the very end, he is invoking his muse. Maud Gonne, his distant muse, more in a rather Thomas Hardy-esque fashion at the very end. I saw her when she was first ready to set out. Wonderful poem at the end of his life. There's where the passion is, so to speak, but the groundedness is somewhere else. There's an invisible ground to all that emotion. And I would even say an erotic ground, at least in the early stages of the marriage, which is hidden in certain poems like, say, Solomon to Sheba and things like that. I am always struck by how much of the personal Yeats is hidden in sort of small corners of his work. You need to quarry away at the poems really to get at the personal life. The marriage, he's one of those poets like Edwin Muir, I think, who was almost rescued by marriage. You can say, Joyce also, marriage was a crucial moment in his life, but Joyce was unusual because Joyce's muse was also his wife.
The other thing about Georgie, as he often, or she's often referred to, that we have to remember here is this is the period of the automatic writing, as it's referred to, that she was the medium through which his poems and poetry came to him. Is that part of the magical nature and the mysticism that you believe in, Paula?
Well, I don't know if I believe in it. I believe he believed in it. Okay. I think she provided two huge supports. I mean, the first one, which can't be negated, is she brought money to the marriage. She brought the house on Merrion Square where he could live in a situation that kind of suited him. I remember he was very affected by meeting Oscar Wilde and the glamour of his being. So again, the showiness of having a house on Merrion Square and a tower down in Galway to commune with the Westerlies spirits really, really was important, and it gave him just a roof over his head and practical stability. But also she was that conduit to his idea of the other world, to his experience of the other world and the dead and the other side behind the veil. So she was marvellously practical and useful in that most esoteric practice. And I think there is evidence that she used it to keep him not on the straight and narrow, because they were quite a bohemian family, and polyamory, which is again very much in the news today. It used to be called free love. So she was very understanding. I think she was an extraordinary force.
I think
in her own right.
The writing of the automatic on their honeymoon, I don't think it was a joyous honeymoon. And she must have wondered how on earth she could hold on to this wild genius. And she produces this automatic writing. And my God, she had him in thrall at once. And she really was a muse, I think. And then she seems to have been tolerant of his romances in the later years of his life. And then when he died, she was a marvelous custodian of the archive and so forth. He really struck gold when he married her, no doubt.
And then the Nobel Laureate Prize came in 1923, which does that link in with Georgie, or is this another new move, or just a simple international recognition of his work?
I think it's simple international recognition. That's in a strange way, I don't think Yeats is one of these poets who is defined by his Nobel status at all, actually. And in fact, it's one of his extraordinary achievements that he beats the terrible myth which has fallen on the Nobel Prize, which is that it's the death of somebody once they get it. So I actually don't think it has much relevance myself.
And he got it for the drama as much as for the lyric poems. And the really great lyric poems of his middle and late years have only recently, in the last few decades, or since the 30s, been recognised as the important thing about Yeats is the lyric poem.
You chose a late poem, Harry, that you wanted us to that you wanted specifically to refer to and talk about. This is politics.
I think you can read Yeats's life almost as two novels. The first is a great Victorian novel, which gets us into the early part of the 20th century. And then it's taken over by a big Thomas Mann novel, a modern novel, in which Yeats becomes a kind of a contemporary figure, dealing with all kinds of the horrors that are arising in Europe. The rise of fascism and totalitarianism, for instance, and the general tragedy of Europe. And very late in his life, and this partly relates actually to what Michael was saying about the intense sort of sexual poems that came in his later life. He did write a very small, rather wooden poem called Politics, in which he talks about himself as a man of the world who knows everything about contemporary politics, knows how to deal with things, but at the same time he's completely captivated by a young woman and feels this isn't something that he's had the experience of. How can I, that girl standing there, my attention fix on Roman or on Russian or on Spanish politics? Yet here's a travelled man that knows what he talks about, and there's a politician that has read and thought. And maybe what they say is true of war and war's alarms, but oh, that I were young again and held her in my arms. I think there's a great actual personal tragedy behind that little, rather stiff little poem, and it's that there's a remark in Roy Foster's biography of Yeats, where at one point Yeats says, one thing I would love to have done was to have had a bottle of wine and with a girl and talked to her, and our talk would lead to us going to bed. And there's a great pathos in that remark, because you feel all the life that wasn't lived at a personal level, that was sacrificed to the enormous labour of making the work, which actually I think was his prime priority.
150 years, the birthday will be celebrated tomorrow, and I'm going to ask you in probably about 15 or 20 seconds each to try to give me, if you like, what for you or what you think is the essence of this poet and man, William Butler Yeats. Paula Meehan?
For me, he provides a model for the integration of all the different parts of the self, the creative and the active, the mystic and the quotidian, that he is. So in a way, he's very suitable for these times when we do crave to integrate the different parts of ourselves and escape from dualism. He's also the sublime role model for hard-working poets.
Harry Clifton?
I think T.S. Eliot wrote a wonderful lecture about Yeats shortly after the death of Yeats, and he came over to the Abbey Theatre to deliver it, and I think it says what I really believe and hold most powerful in Yeats, which was his capacity to go on growing as an artist, not just as a theoretician or a technician, but as a whole being, right to the very end of his life. And he's the single greatest exemplar of the capacity to grow as a whole person.
And Michael Longley?
I agree with both my friends. For me, he is a great energizer and a great encourager. I mean, he was an encourager of women poets. He was an encourager of Yeats and Synge. And there's something radiant about him when I think about him, and I think of him as the greatest poet in the English language since Shakespeare.
Well, that's almost it from this arena celebration of the life and work of William Butler Yeats. My thanks to Paula Meehan, Michael Longley and Harry Clifton. Noel Roberts was on sound this evening. Elaine Conlon was the broadcast coordinator, and tonight's programme was produced by Sinead Mooney. I'll be back with you on Monday evening, as usual, at 7 o'clock here on RTE Radio 1. But we leave you this evening with perhaps one of the best loved and best known verses of William Butler Yeats, Down by the Sally Gardens. Fionnuala Moynihan is on piano and her sister Deirdre is singing.
Agree.